The Middle Ages, that period spanning from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the Renaissance in the 15th century, is often imagined as a time of knights in shining armor, castles surrounded by moats, and epic battles where honor and glory were fought for with sword, lance, or sheer stubbornness. But amidst this scene, which seems lifted from an epic poem overflowing with testosterone, poorly trimmed beards, and horses probably as weary as the soldiers, there were women who defied the expectations of their time. The warrior women of the Middle Ages, though often relegated to the shadows of chronicles written by monks with biased quills and a clear preference for male heroes, were real figures who took up arms, led armies, defended fortresses, or navigated politics with a cunning that left more than one knight wondering whether they should practice more with their sword or simply surrender and ask for advice. This account, informative but with a touch of humor that doesn't clash, will take you through the lives of these women, their motivations, the obstacles they faced, and the impact they left on a world where the rules seemed to shout in unison, "Leave the swords to the men." Get ready for a long journey, because the stories of these women deserve every word, and if the Middle Ages teach us anything, it's that patience and resilience are as valuable as any weapon. To understand the role of warrior women, one must first dive into the organized chaos that was the Middle Ages. Medieval society was structured like a rigid pyramid, with kings, nobles, and bishops at the top, dictating rules from thrones, castles, or cathedrals. In the middle, knights, clerics, and merchants played their roles, whether fighting, praying, or counting coins, and at the base, peasants toiled from dawn to dusk, plowing fields, paying tributes, and likely wondering why no one consulted them before starting another war. Women, for the most part, were destined for what we might call supporting roles. Wives managing households, mothers raising future feudal lords, nuns praying for everyone's souls, or, at best, administrators of lands while the men were busy pillaging villages, fighting in crusades, or, in some cases, simply lost in a tavern. But the Middle Ages was no place to sit quietly embroidering tapestries while the world crumbled. Viking invasions, endless crusades, feudal wars, uninvited plagues, and the occasional dragon, at least in legends, made survival depend on collective action. In that context, some women decided that, rather than waiting for men to sort things out, it was better to take up a sword, a shield, or the reins of the situation, because sitting idly by wasn't an option when the enemy was literally knocking at the gate. Warrior women were not the norm, but they weren't as exceptional as the chroniclers. Almost all men, and often clerics with a worldview narrower than a drawbridge, would have us believe. In a world where violence was as common as stale bread, murky water, and disputes over who had rights to a particular patch of land, noblewomen, in particular, often found themselves forced to take charge when their husbands, fathers, or brothers were absent, dead, or, in some cases, simply not up to the task. Defending a castle, negotiating with allies, organizing a city's defense, or even leading an army didn't come with an instruction manual. But these women managed with a mix of courage, pragmatism, and, likely, a sigh of exasperation at the sluggishness of some knights who spent more time polishing their armor than planning the battle. Picture a noblewoman, in a dress heavier than a sack of grain, organizing archers on the ramparts while enemies batter the gate with a ram and some novice soldier asks, "My lady, where do we keep the boiling oil?" It wasn't the life plan sold to them in childhood, when they were taught to sew, pray, or, at best, manage household accounts, but they adapted, or the castle fell, and with it, everything they defended. A prime example of this leadership is Matilda of Tuscany, known as the Great Countess, a figure who could have inspired any modern fantasy saga, except her story is real and didn't need dragons, wizards, or enchanted swords to be epic. Born in 1046, Matilda was not just a noble with a grandiose title and a castle overlooking the Italian countryside. She was a top-tier military strategist, a woman who commanded armies with the same ease others managed a banquet or a chess game. In the 11th century, Europe was embroiled in the investiture controversy, a conflict pitting Pope Gregory VII against Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in a dispute blending theology, politics, and a level of drama worthy of a medieval soap opera, but with more excommunications, fewer happy endings, and a wardrobe of heavy cloaks and awkward crowns. Matilda, a staunch ally of the Pope, didn't limit herself to sending supportive letters, donating a few horses, or praying for victory from the comfort of a convent. She led armies herself, planned ambushes, organized defenses, and turned her fortress of Canossa into a symbol of resistance. It was there, in 1077, that Henry IV had to wait 3 days in the snow, barefoot and in penitent's clothing, to beg the Pope's forgiveness in what became known as the Humiliation of Canossa. Matilda, likely watching from a window with a cup of something warm, perhaps an herbal infusion, since coffee hadn't yet reached Europe, must have thought, "Let him wait a bit longer. The cold will teach him manners and maybe cool his ego." Her ability to navigate both battlefield and politics, moving between swords and scrolls, made her one of the most powerful figures of her time, and her legacy proves that women could be as feared as any mustachioed feudal lord with an oversized sword and a penchant for impulsive decisions. Matilda was not an exception in the sense that noblewomen often took on military leadership roles when circumstances demanded it, and those circumstances were more frequent than one might imagine. In the Middle Ages, castles weren't just fancy residences with pretty towers, countryside views, and a moat that smelled of stagnant water. They were fortresses that could determine the fate of a region, a kingdom, or even a war. When a lord was away, on a crusade, a local war, an overly prolonged pilgrimage, or say, lost in a tavern somewhere in France debating who had the best falcon, the women of the family took charge. This wasn't just about issuing orders from a tower, gazing melodramatically at the horizon. It involved organizing defenses, managing resources, negotiating with allies or enemies, and, in some cases, facing danger head-on. During a siege, a noblewoman might be overseeing the pouring of boiling oil from the ramparts, ensuring archers had enough arrows, organizing shifts so soldiers didn't fall asleep on duty, or even donning armor to inspire the troops. It wasn't uncommon for these women to have basic knowledge of military tactics, learned from observing their fathers, husbands, or brothers, or simply because, in a world where war was constant, ignoring how to defend oneself was like ignoring how to eat, breathe, or keep bread from turning harder than stone. And let's be honest, some of these women were likely better strategists than the men who strutted around in embroidered cloaks, with grandiose titles and speeches that didn't always translate into victories. Another notable case is Nicola de la Haye, a 13th century English noblewoman who proved that defending a castle wasn't just for men in heavy armor, with even heavier egos and a tendency to underestimate their opponents. During the First Barons' War, 1215 to 1217, Nicola, who was no spring chicken and likely had more experience than half the knights under her command, defended Lincoln Castle against French invaders with a determination that left chroniclers, who weren't prone to praising women, no choice but to acknowledge her bravery. She organized the defense, withstood the siege, managed resources with the precision of a modern accountant, and probably rolled her eyes at soldiers complaining about the cold, hunger, or enemy arrows that didn't come with a warning. Picture the scene, as the French tried to scale the walls with ladders that looked like they came from a shoddy workshop. Nicola was on the ramparts, giving orders with the calm of someone planning a party, but instead of cakes, she was distributing arrows, stones, and, if needed, a few motivational shouts to get the soldiers running to their posts. Her leadership not only saved the castle but had a strategic impact on the war, proving that women could be as crucial on the battlefield as any knight with armor shinier than it should be, likely because they spent more time polishing it than practicing with a sword. But not all warrior women were nobles with castles, armies, or titles granting them authority in a hierarchy-obsessed world. Some came from humbler or less documented origins, and their presence in history relies on fragmented chronicles, oral tales, or, in some cases, pure speculation backed by archaeological finds that make us rethink what we thought we knew. The Crusades, for instance, offer a glimpse into these less visible women, whose stories often get lost among the exploits of knights and kings. Between 1096 and 1291, the Crusades were a mix of religious fervor, territorial ambition, and logistics that, let's say, weren't always up to par. Crusaders marched to the Holy Land with visions of divine glory, only to face hunger, disease, enemies who didn't share their enthusiasm, and a climate that was anything but welcoming. While chronicles focus on the knights, kings, and clerics leading these expeditions, there are mentions of women who participated actively, not just as nurses, cooks, or wives following their husbands, but as combatants. In the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, for example, there are accounts of women taking up arms in moments of desperation, when crusaders were surrounded and survival depended on everyone, regardless of gender, fighting. It's easy to imagine one of these women, fed up with mending tunics in a dusty camp, cooking gruel with more sand than grain, or listening to soldiers complain about the heat, saying, "Hand me a spear. I'm done scrubbing, and if I'm going to die, it'll be with something more epic than a ladle." Though the monks writing the Chronicles rarely gave them names, apparently, it was more important to detail how many lances a knight broke in a tournament or how many days a bishop fasted. Their presence lingers between the lines, an echo of their courage that refuses to be silenced. A particularly fascinating phenomenon is that of women who disguise themselves as men to join the fight, because in an era where gender norms were stricter than ill-fitting chainmail, sometimes the only way to get onto the battlefield was to pretend to be part of the boys' club. These women would cut their hair, don armor, and pass as knights, soldiers, or even mercenaries, a job not exactly known for its benefits or inclusive environment. This wasn't just about bravery but ingenuity. Blending into a military camp full of men required a mix of boldness, cunning, and probably a hefty dose of patience to endure crude campfire jokes, debates over who had the biggest sword, literally and figuratively, and inevitable strength contests after a few mugs of watered-down beer. They had to modulate their voices, avoid certain latrine conversations, learn to walk under the weight of armor not designed for a woman's body, and, in some cases, practice a few masculine phrases or curses to fit in with the other soldiers. Those sources are scarce. Chroniclers weren't keen on documenting women who defied norms. There are records of women joining armies under male identities, especially during prolonged conflicts like the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. Imagine the stress. Not only dodging arrows, swords, the occasional runaway horse, and mud that seemed to have a life of its own, but also ensuring no one noticed your beard didn't grow, your voice was a bit higher than expected, or you skipped the impromptu camp strength contests. These women didn't just challenge enemies on the battlefield. They defied a society that wanted them in the kitchen, the convent, or, at best, embroidering a tapestry no one would look at because everyone was too busy fighting or complaining about the weather. The most iconic figure of this type, and perhaps of all medieval warrior women, is Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who became the very symbol of resistance, courage, and the ability to make an entire army feel slightly ashamed for not matching her determination. Born around 1412 in a humble family in Domremy, France, Joan had no noble title, military training, or formal education, but she had faith that could move mountains, or at least armies, and an audacity that made her seem straight out of an epic tale. At 17, she claimed to have received visions from saints, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, a celestial lineup that left no room for doubt, ordering her to free France from the English during the 100 Years' War, a conflict that, despite its name, lasted over a century and left everyone exhausted, probably including the horses, tired of carrying knights back and forth. Joan, with a mix of charisma, religious conviction, and boldness that would make her a charismatic leader or at least a social media influencer with millions of followers sharing inspirational quotes today, convinced the Dauphin Charles, later Charles VII, to let her lead an army. She wasn't just a figurehead or an inspirational mascot for the troops. She donned armor, rode a horse, wielded a sword, and led charges against the English, inspiring soldiers with an energy that likely made them feel a bit embarrassed if they complained about fatigue, mud, or the camp's bland soup. In 1429, her leadership was key to lifting the siege of Orléans, a turning point that gave hope to the French and shifted the war's momentum, proving that a 17-year-old peasant girl could do more for France than many nobles with grandiose titles. But, as often happens with heroines, her story ended tragically. Captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English, in 1430, she was tried for heresy, witchcraft, and, among other things, daring to wear men's clothing, apparently as serious a crime as leading an army against the enemy. Burned at the stake in 1431 at age 19, her death was not only a tragedy but a brutal reminder of the risks faced by women who defied norms. Joan was not just a warrior but a symbol of resistance, and her canonization in 1920 is a belated recognition of a life that broke all the rules and showed that a peasant girl with a vision could change history, even if the price was too high. Joan wasn't the only woman who took up arms out of conviction, but her story stands out for its impact and the way she challenged the power structures of her time. from kings to clerics who'd rather burn her than admit a woman could lead an army. However, other warrior women found ways to influence without divine visions, armies, or swords, using cunning, diplomacy, and political power as their weapons. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most fascinating figures of the 12th century, is a perfect example of a woman who combined political power with an innate talent for strategy, proving that a sword wasn't always needed to win a war. Born in 1122, Eleanor was the heiress to the Duchy of Aquitaine, making her one of the wealthiest and most powerful women of her time. A kind of medieval billionaire with a wardrobe that probably required its own castle and a team of servants just to fold her cloaks. Married first to King Louis VII of France and later to King Henry II of England, Eleanor wasn't one to stay home waiting for news, knitting socks for crusaders, or sighing by the window while men decided the kingdom's fate. During the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, she accompanied Louis to the Holy Land, and though chronicles don't show her wielding a sword or charging against Saracens, she played a role in organizing the expedition, ensuring the women accompanying the Crusaders had active roles in logistics, morale, and probably keeping knights who got distracted debating whose horse was prettiest or armor shiniest in check. It's said Eleanor arrived in the Holy Land with a retinue of ladies dressed in outfits that caused more than one crusader to faint, though it was likely more a morale-boosting strategy than a fashion statement. Later, as Queen of England, she didn't hesitate to lead rebellions against her own husband when he failed to meet her expectations, which, given Eleanor's character, were probably higher than a Gothic cathedral and harder to reach than a well-fortified castle. Picture the family dinner. "Henry, dear, pass the wine. And by the way, I'm organizing a rebellion with your sons because someone has to sort out this kingdom, and it's clearly not you." Eleanor was a master of diplomacy, strategy, and patience, and her life shows that a woman's power in the Middle Ages could be as lethal as any sword, even without wielding one, and that a queen could change history with a mix of intelligence, audacity, and a wardrobe that intimidated everyone. If we shift to the Eurasian steppes, we find another type of warrior women, those of nomadic peoples like the Scythians, Sarmatians, and later the Mongols, where war wasn't exclusively male, and women had a far more active role than in Western Europe's feudal societies. Accounts from Greek historians like Herodotus, likely written with a mix of awe, skepticism, and a touch of envy, describe women who rode, hunted, and fought alongside men, armed with bows, spears, and an attitude that brooked no excuses or whining. Archaeological excavations have backed these stories, with tombs of women buried with weapons, armor, and sometimes horses, suggesting they weren't just exceptions but part of a deeply rooted tradition in these cultures. These warriors had no castles, noble titles, or courts debating heraldry or the latest cloak fashion. Their life on the steppes demanded skills that made them as feared as any male warrior, and probably more so, since they had to deal with icy winds, wolves, and enemies while keeping balance on a galloping horse. Imagine one of these women, riding across the plains with a bow in hand, shooting arrows with precision that would make any European knight pale, while the wind touzles her hair and the men beside her try not to fall behind, probably praying not to be her next target. Meanwhile, in the courts of France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire, ladies debated whether cross-stitch was better than chain-stitch, and would likely have fainted seeing a Sarmatian woman charge an enemy with the same ease as cutting thread or discussing castle curtain colors. In the medieval Islamic world, we also find remarkable figures who defied their time's norms, proving that courage and skill weren't exclusive to one region or culture. Khalla bint al-Azwar, a 7th century Arab warrior, is an example blending history and legend, but her existence testifies to women's ability to stand out in unlikely contexts, even in societies with strict gender roles. According to chronicles, Khalla fought alongside Muslim armies during the early Islamic conquests, excelling with her swordsmanship, bravery on the battlefield, and a presence that likely made her comrades think twice before making an off-color remark. On one occasion, she was captured by the Byzantines, who thought she was a man until she removed her helmet, probably with a look that said, "Surprise, boys, I'm more dangerous than you thought, and I'm not here to serve tea." Her story, though wrapped in idealization by Arab chroniclers who tended to embellish feats to inspire future generations, shows that women could find ways to shine, even in environments where social expectations relegated them to secondary roles. Khalla didn't just fight. she inspired others, becoming a symbol of resistance, and one can imagine her comrade saying, "Don't mess with Kala. Her sword cuts faster than gossip in a Damascus market, and probably with more precision." Her legacy, though less documented than European figures, reminds us that warrior women weren't exclusive to the West but appeared wherever necessity, opportunity, or sheer frustration demanded it. In the Iberian Peninsula, during the Reconquista, we also find women who left their mark, though Christian and Muslim chronicles tend to focus on men, because apparently it was more important to detail the exploits of a knight who fell off his horse mid-charge or a king who lost half his kingdom to a bad decision. Jimena Diaz, the wife of El Cid, is a notable example of a woman who, though not wielding a sword on the battlefield, played an active role in defending and managing territories. Beyond her role as the loyal, suffering wife in the Canta de Mio Cid, an epic poem that likely exaggerated El Cid's virtues while downplaying Jimena's, historical sources indicate she played a crucial role in managing Valencia after El Cid conquered it in 1094. At one point, she even defended the city against Almoravid attacks, organizing resistance, managing resources, and ensuring the walls didn't fall, all while navigating a society that preferred to see her as a decorative figure. She wasn't a warrior charging into battle with a sword like in a Hollywood movie, but her leadership in times of crisis made her a key figure, and let's be honest, dealing with El Cid, with his penchant for epic fights, conquering cities, and starring in epic poems, was a battle in itself. Jimena must have had nerves of steel, logistical skills to rival any general, and probably a sense of humor to handle her husband's eccentricities, who wasn't exactly the type to stay home reading poetry. In the Nordic regions, Viking sagas speak of shieldmaidens or skjoldmo, women who fought alongside men with axes, swords, and shields, and who were probably the nightmare of any enemy who underestimated their strength or determination. Though it's hard to separate fact from myth, figures like Lagertha, popularized by modern series like Vikings, may be based on real stories of women who actively participated in raids, battles, and expeditions. Archaeological excavations have found tombs of Viking women buried with weapons, armor, and sometimes horses, suggesting some were warriors in the most literal sense, not just decorative figures or legendary characters. Picture a shield maiden on a drakkar, rowing toward a raid with the icy northern wind in her face, while the rest of the crew tries not to get seasick, fall overboard, or worse, fall behind in combat. These women were not only strong but also strategic, able to navigate, fight, and survive in an environment where weakness wasn't an option, and failure meant not just defeat but possibly becoming the subject of an unflattering saga. Their presence in the sagas, though often embellished with a touch of epic flair and exaggeration to impress audiences, reflects a society where women could play a more active role in war than in Western Europe's feudal courts. A shield maiden didn't just wield an axe. She knew how to keep morale high, probably with a mix of sharp commands, a few jokes about fleeing enemies, and a look that said, "If you don't row faster, I'll use you as an anchor." Warrior women didn't just face enemies on the battlefield but also their society's prejudices, which were as formidable as any invading army and probably more persistent. Gender norms were a constant obstacle. A woman with a sword, a bow, or even a military command was seen as an anomaly, if not a direct threat to the social order, which seemed designed to keep women in the kitchen, the convent, or, at best, managing household accounts. Chroniclers, almost all men and often clerics with a worldview narrower than a faulty drawbridge, tended to downplay their feats or present them as divine exceptions, as if a woman could only fight if God, the saints, or a miracle gave explicit permission. This is especially clear in Joan of Arc's case, whose story was framed as divine intervention to avoid questioning the social norms of the time, because admitting a peasant girl could lead an army out of sheer will was too much for the clerics writing history. But even without visions or miracles, many women found ways to overcome these barriers, whether through cunning, diplomacy, or simply ignoring criticism and doing what needed to be done. Access to military training was limited for women. While men learned to handle swords, lances, or bows from childhood, women had to figure it out, whether by learning in secret, observing their fathers, husbands, or brothers, or leveraging their social position to gain tactical knowledge. Then there was the issue of armor. Putting on chainmail was like trying to move a wardrobe single-handedly, and it wasn't designed for a woman's body, meaning these women had to deal with uncomfortable, heavy, and often ill-fitting gear. Picture the challenge of fighting with 20 kilos of metal on, trying not to trip over your own cloak, keeping balance on a horse that doesn't always cooperate, and avoiding some knight's look that says, "Shouldn't you be at home sewing or praying?" Yet these women managed, proving that will was stronger than any ill-fitting chainmail, any snide comment, or any enemy daring to underestimate them. Another aspect we can't overlook is the role of women in military and religious orders, which, though mostly male-exclusive, offered some opportunities for women, especially in strategic support roles that were as crucial as combat itself. In the Iberian Peninsula, for example, the Order of Santiago allowed some women to participate as comendadoras, managing lands, resources, and, in some cases, contributing to planning military campaigns. They weren't warriors in the strict sense, wielding swords or charging on horseback, but their role was essential to keeping the medieval war machine running, ensuring knights had food, weapons, and a place to sleep after battles. In other cases, noblewomen acted as benefactors, funding armies, donating resources, or engaging in diplomacy to secure alliances that could decide a war's outcome. It was like saying, if I can't fight directly, I'll at least pay for others to do it well, and I'll make sure they do it my way, because someone has to keep this in order. These women, though not always on the front lines, were vital to the war effort, proving that leadership could take many forms, from the sword to the pen, via the purse and a good dose of common sense. The cultural impact of warrior women is also worth noting, as their stories were not only lived but told, sung, and, in many cases, distorted to fit the era's narratives, which preferred male heroes and women who stayed in their place. In the Chansons de Geste, medieval epic poems celebrating the deeds of knights like Roland, El Cid, or any noble with shiny armor and a knack for getting into trouble, women who took up arms occasionally appear, though often disguised as men or under the excuse of a divine mission, because apparently it was more acceptable for a woman to fight if inspired by God than if she simply wanted to defend her home, family, or prove she was better than the boastful knight next door. In medieval art, depictions of warrior women, like the Amazons of classical mythology or biblical figures like Judith, who beheaded Holofernes with a mix of cunning, courage, and a well-sharpened knife, served as inspiration but also as a warning. A woman with a weapon was powerful but dangerous, and needed to be kept in check, lest she start questioning who ruled the castle. In oral traditions, especially in less centralized cultures like the Nordic, Celtic, or steppe peoples, stories of brave women were passed down through generations, often with a touch of humor to make them more palatable, because recounting a woman defeating a knight in a duel, leading a successful siege, or navigating a drakkar through a storm didn't sit well in every tavern, especially if the knight in question was present, still nursing his wounded pride. Legends also played a crucial role in the perception of warrior women. As in the Middle Ages, the line between history and myth was blurrier than a waterlogged parchment. Tales of Amazons, kingdoms of women who fought like men, lived without feudal lords, and probably had better navigation skills than most European explorers, circulated through Europe, fueled by travelers like Marco Polo, who returned with stories sounding like fantasy, or chroniclers who exaggerated to captivate audiences who lacked Netflix but had an insatiable appetite for epic tales. Though these stories were more myth than reality, they reflected the medieval fascination with women who broke norms, even if they were often presented as exotic, supernatural, or outright impossible, because admitting a woman could be as skilled with a sword, bow, or strategy as a man was, for many chroniclers, a concept too revolutionary, as if the world would crumble if they acknowledged women could do more than embroider or pray. In a way, these legends were a means of processing the existence of women who defied expectations, though chroniclers preferred to wrap them in a fantastical aura to avoid grappling with the idea that a woman could lead an army, defend a castle, or shoot a bow better than the knight who spent his days boasting about his lineage. The life of a warrior woman was no bed of roses, not even roses with thorns, which at least could have doubled as an improvised weapon in a pinch. Beyond the obvious risks of combat, arrows whistling too close, swords that didn't distinguish between genders, runaway horses with their own agendas, and the occasional traitor stabbing you in the back, literally or figuratively. They faced social condemnation, excommunication, or even death. Joan of Arc is the clearest example. Her bravery made her a heroine to the French but a target for the English and Burgundians, who couldn't stomach a peasant girl challenging their authority, let alone winning. Other, less famous women likely faced similar punishments, from ostracism to execution, especially if they dared to question gender norms too openly, because nothing scared a patriarchal society more than a woman who not only fought but did it well. Logistics were also a formidable challenge. Armor didn't come in women's sizes, meaning they had to deal with uncomfortable, heavy, and often ill-fitting gear that probably caused more chafing than a poorly designed saddle. Swords were heavy, lances hard to wield without proper training, and bows required strength not gained from embroidering tapestries or praying in a convent. Then there were the allies, often skeptical if not outright hostile, because the idea of following a woman's orders was, for many, as unthinkable as a castle without walls. Imagine leading an army and having a knight look at you like, "Are you sure you wouldn't rather be sewing or praying?" These women's patience must have been as sharp as their weapons, and their ability to navigate social perceptions was as critical as their battlefield skills. In many cases, their success depended on using religion, diplomacy, or an impeccable reputation to justify their actions, because a woman fighting without an acceptable excuse, like divine visions or defending her family, was seen as a threat to the established order, and that could cost her everything. To add more depth to this account, it's worth exploring lesser-known cases that illustrate the diversity of warrior women in the Middle Ages, as not all were queens, countesses, or peasant girls with divine visions. In England, beyond Nicola de la Haye, we find Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians in the 10th century, a figure who deserves a prominent place in this story, not just for her achievements but because she shows women could be military leaders in a world where Vikings were every kingdom's nightmare. Daughter of Alfred the Great, the king who unified much of England against Viking invasions, Ethelflaed ruled Mercia, modern-day central England, after her husband Ethelred's death, becoming a key military leader in the fight against the Norse invaders. She built fortresses, led armies, and reconquered territories, earning the respect of her contemporaries, who called her the Lady of the Mercians, with a mix of admiration, awe, and probably a bit of envy. Picture Ethelflaed organizing a city's defense as Vikings batter the gates with their axes, likely thinking, "If my father could handle them, so can I, and I'll build a couple more fortresses to make sure they don't try again." Her leadership not only ensured Mercia's survival but laid the groundwork for England's unification under her brother, Edward the Elder, a feat likely impossible without her work. Ethelflaed shows how women could wield military and political power in a world of limited opportunities, and her story reminds us that warrior women didn't always need a sword to make their mark. Sometimes, good strategy and a few well-placed fortresses were more than enough. In the Byzantine Empire, women also played significant roles in times of crisis, though their stories are less known in the West, probably because European chroniclers were too busy writing about knights and crusades. Anna Komnene, the 12th century Byzantine historian, wasn't a warrior in the physical sense, but her account of the First Crusade in the Alexiad shows deep knowledge of military strategy, likely learned from her father, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who wasn't exactly one to sit idle during a threat. Anna didn't wield weapons, but her influence in court, her ability to document her father's campaigns, and her role as an advisor suggest women could play strategic roles even in a male-dominated environment. In other cases, Byzantine empresses and nobles organized defenses or funded armies, especially during Arab, Bulgarian, or later Crusader invasions. For example, Empress Irene of Athens in the 8th century, though better known for her political role and being one of the first women to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name, took steps to strengthen the empire's defenses during a time of instability, proving an empress could be as formidable as any general, especially when it came to holding an empire together. In North Africa and the Near East, beyond Khala bint al-Azwar, there are mentions of other women who participated in Islamic conquests or resisted crusaders, though their names are often lost in chronicles that preferred to focus on emirs, caliphs, or crusader knights. In Al-Andalus, during the Reconquista, women from Muslim elites sometimes organized city defenses, acted as spies, or engaged in diplomacy to avoid sieges or buy time. For instance, in the 13th century, during the fall of cities like Córdoba or Seville, women from ruling families played key roles in organizing resistance, managing resources, sending messages to allies, or negotiating with Christians to save their communities. These women leveraged their positions to go unnoticed, moving through the shadows of history, but their impact was undeniable, as a city doesn't withstand a siege with just swords. It also needs food, water, morale, and someone to keep everything in order while the men are busy fighting or debating strategies that don't always work. In Celtic and Slavic cultures, women also had a more active role in war than in more centralized feudal societies, where gender norms were stricter than poorly designed armor. In Celtic legends, figures like Queen Med from the Irish epic Táin Bua Cúailnge are depicted as military leaders who not only planned strategies but fought in battles, leading armies with a ferocity that made enemies tremble and probably caused more than one headache for their allies. Though wrapped in mythology, these stories reflect a reality where women could take leadership roles in wartime, especially in societies with less rigid social structures where survival depended on everyone's contribution. Med, for instance, is described as a queen who not only led armies but negotiated alliances, manipulated rivals, and ensured her kingdom of Connaught wasn't an easy target. Picture Med in the middle of a battlefield, giving orders as Celtic warriors try not to trip over their own spears, probably thinking, "If this queen can lead a charge, I can stop complaining about the mud." In Slavic lands, tales of women defending villages or joining raids against neighboring tribes suggest war wasn't exclusively male. These women, often armed with whatever was at hand, spears, knives, bows, or even farm tools turned into makeshift weapons, showed that bravery didn't depend on a title, armor, or formal training, but on the will to protect what mattered. The transition to the late Middle Ages brought significant changes to the role of warrior women, as the world was changing, and not necessarily in their favor. With the rise of centralized states, professional armies, and the introduction of gunpowder, wars became more technical and less reliant on individual bravery, swordsmanship, or the ability to inspire troops with a rousing speech. Armies began to consist of trained, paid soldiers rather than feudal militias where anyone with enough courage could grab a weapon and join the fight. This reduced opportunities for women to participate directly in combat, as professional armies were almost exclusively male, and social norms grew stricter, relegating women to more domestic, diplomatic, or religious spaces. Yet the legacy of warrior women endured, transforming into new forms of female leadership in the Renaissance and beyond. Figures like Isabella the Catholic in the 15th century, though not a warrior in the strict sense, played a key role in organizing the Reconquista, funding armies, negotiating alliances, and making strategic decisions that changed Spain's history. Isabella, who likely had to deal with courtiers questioning her authority and generals who thought they knew better, proved a queen could be as formidable as any knight, especially when it came to uniting a kingdom and conquering the last Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula. The cultural impact of warrior women wasn't limited to their time, as their stories were not only lived but told, sung, and often reinvented to fit the era's narratives. In medieval literature, figures like Bradamante, a fictional female knight in Ariosto's epic Orlando Furioso, reflect the fascination with warrior women, though they were often presented as exceptions, idealized characters, or figures needing divine or magical justification for their battlefield presence. Bradamante, for example, is depicted as a knight fighting with the same skill as any man, but her story is wrapped in a fantastical aura, as it was apparently easier to accept a warrior woman if she came with a touch of magic or a prophetic destiny. In medieval art, depictions of warrior women, like the Amazons, Judith, or idealized versions of Joan of Arc, served as a reminder that women could be powerful but also as a warning of the dangers of defying norms, as a woman with a sword was, for many, as unsettling an idea as a dragon loose in the village. In oral traditions, especially in less centralized cultures like the Nordic, Celtic, or steppe peoples, stories of brave women were told with a touch of epic flair, humor, and sometimes exaggeration, because nothing sold a story better than a tale of a woman defeating an arrogant knight, leading a successful siege, or navigating a drakkar through a storm, then sitting down for a beer in the tavern while the men tried to process what they'd just seen. To explore the topic further, it's worth examining how warrior women adapted to their time's realities, as the Middle Ages weren't a monolithic period, and opportunities for women varied by region, culture, and historical moment. In the early Middle Ages, before the year 1000, society was more fluid in some ways, as the lack of centralized power meant women, especially in the elites, could take on leadership roles more easily. In Visigothic, Merovingian, or Carolingian kingdoms, queens and noblewomen often acted as regents, advisors, or even defenders of their territories when men were absent or incapacitated. For example, in Visigothic Hispania before the Muslim conquest in 711, queens like Livigoto, wife of King Erwig, played active roles in politics and, in some cases, organizing defenses, though Visigothic chronicles don't always give them the credit they deserve. In Anglo-Saxon England, women like Edbur, an 8th century queen, wielded military and political influence, though their legacy was often distorted by chroniclers who preferred to paint them as villains rather than competent leaders. In the Central Middle Ages, between the 11th and 13th centuries, feudalism solidified, and social norms grew stricter, but women still found ways to participate in war, especially in crises. During the Crusades, for instance, women didn't just accompany armies as wives, nurses, or cooks but took more active roles. In the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, there are mentions of women helping defend crusader camps, and though chroniclers don't always name them, there are accounts of women wielding bows or spears when needed. Picture one of these women in the desert, with the sun scorching her skin, saying, "If the knights can't hold the camp, someone has to, and it looks like it's me." In Europe, noblewomen continued defending castles, like Sibylla of Anjou, Countess of Flanders, who in the 12th century organized her territory's defense while her husband was in the Holy Land, proving a woman could keep a county standing even when the men were off chasing divine glory. In the late Middle Ages, the 14th and 15th centuries, warrior women faced new challenges but also found new ways to influence. The Hundred Years' War beyond Joan of Arc saw women like Jeanne de Montfort, known as Joan the Flame, who defended her husband's cause in Brittany during the succession conflicts of the 14th century. Jeanne not only organized city defenses but, according to chronicles, actively fought, leading troops and even setting enemy camps ablaze, earning her nickname. Imagine Jeanne, torch in hand, looking at enemy soldiers and saying, "If you want my castle, you'll have to go through me, and bring a bucket of water while you're at it." Her story, though less known than Joan of Arc's, shows how women could combine physical bravery with strategy to protect their interests. The legacy of medieval warrior women is complex, as their stories were often minimized, distorted, or outright ignored by chroniclers who preferred to focus on men or present women as divine exceptions, because admitting a woman could lead an army or defend a castle through sheer skill was too much for the era's male ego. Yet their impact endured in literature, art, oral tradition, and later historical studies that sought to reclaim their names from oblivion. Figures like Matilda of Tuscany, Joan of Arc, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Calla bint al-Azwar, Nicola de la Haye, Ethelflaed, Jeanne de Montfort, and the warriors of the steppes, Nordic, Celtic, Slavic, and Islamic worlds testify to women's ability to defy a world that wanted them in the shadows. Their stories remind us that courage has no gender, and even in the darkest times, there were always women ready to take up a sword, a shield, or the reins of their destiny and say, "Let's see who dares."